Okay, so if Peter allows me, I will start with a very brief introduction. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Andreas Gloeckner. Professor Gloeckner has published in the very top journals, including PNAS, Nature Communications, and many others. Although he is very young, he already managed to publish well over 100 articles, which is super impressive. I have to learn from you. Andreas also serves for many years as the co-editor of the JDM journal. So this is information for all the guys here. Now we will proceed as follows. So we will start with a presentation for about 45-50 minutes, and then we will have about 10 minutes for questions. And then those who have to go will be free to go, and we will stay for informal discussion for about additional 15 to 20 minutes. So if it's fine with you, Andreas, the floor is all yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Joachim, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to the symposium. It's really great to see you all. And yeah, to have some opinions and criticism about my most recent work. Actually, it's not about in line with my classic work on risky choice and probabilistic inferences, but in a different stream of research which I've followed up in the last years about investigating cross-national interaction. The title of my talk is Modeling Cross-National Social Preferences. It's joint work with Vanessa Clemens, Marina Aurifici, and Angela Doro, and it's funded by the German Science Foundation. As you will see later on, it's a very, very expensive project. So without the funder, this would not have been possible. So what is this all about? We want to investigate cross-national social preferences. What is this? Social preferences, or in psychology, we call this social value orientation, but it's the same concept. It's basically the questions how and how much do we take into account outcomes for others in our social decision-making. So the question, the first part of it is which kind of model can be used to describe how much we take into account others' outcomes in our decision-making? Do we need, which functional form does it have? Do we need 1, 2 parameters or some kind of functions? And yeah, how much do we take this into account? This is the core question. And what are cross-national interactions? This follows from a recent research line, which we followed up and have conducted now for 8 years or so in many studies. The idea there is basically not just comparing behavior from persons within one country, or also not the behavior of persons between countries, like in the classic studies, you have studies in 5 countries, and then you compare the averages there also. But we want to go a step further and investigate cross-national interactions. So basically, for many countries, how people interact with people from many other countries. So not only interactions of people within one country, and also not only social preferences and how pro-social you are to people from your own country, but basically how pro-social you are to people from all other kinds of countries. And how we can explain this, how we can describe this, how we can describe this mathematically. And of course, this variance then should be explained somehow with properties by the person. So this is perhaps just due to the fact that pro-social people are pro-social to everyone, or the receiver country. Just know that you interact with a person from Israel or from Japan or from the Netherlands, or the diet. So basically the specific combination between your country and the other country. And what are the most prominent factors that we take into account, which we also try to integrate theoretically? This is based on our earlier work. Intergroup perception and stereotypes seem to play a very important role there. So basically, the stereotypes we have about other nations. The thing is, and we have this in the current study as well, that 85% of the people indicate that they didn't have any contact with people or the other country which they are acting here. So basically, it's not decision based on experience. It's not decision based on description. It's decision based on some kind of stereotypes and beliefs and a quite complex structure. And what we take into account here, and I will discuss it a bit later, is the three-factor model of stereotypes, the ABC model. It's a bit an extension of the classic stereotype content model. So basically, agency is how rich or how strong a country is. Belief is a measure of how conservative or liberal a country is, and communion is basically a warmth factor, how trustworthy, how warm another country is. And it's all about stereotypes, all about expectations. So it's not about how this country really is, but how other countries think this country is. Then we take into account conflict theory, realistic group conflict, so the direct conflict between the countries. We also take into account similarity and status in the group. This is a long tradition in social psychology. From social identity theory, we already know the classic prediction: you would probably be more pro-social to people from the in-group than to the out-group. And this is found in many theories, many experiments. Interestingly, from other theories like social categorization theory, you could also make the opposite prediction, that you are more competitive to the in-group, or perhaps even more competitive to more similar people as compared to dissimilar people. But the standard finding is in-group favoritism. One very interesting finding recently by Carsten de Troy and some other, Angelo Romano and some other persons from the Netherlands, is that they also found unexpectedly in a somewhat other game the so-called nasty neighbor effect. So basically exactly the opposite, that people are less pro-social to the in-group than to the out. Yeah, and so we will compare and contrast these two, and we will find a way also to basically explain why both of them happened. And we will also look at economic institutional factors. I will explain it later, but it's not so the core of the current talk. So how do we measure social preferences and also cross-national social preferences? A very simple thing. People get some money and they can split the money between themselves and some other people. So that's like in a classic dictator game. You see here in the upper corner of the presentation, person from Germany has $2 and can give some money of this to people from Japan. It's anonymous. You just know that the other person is from Japan, and you know that the other person knows that you're from Germany, but you don't. There are no direct or other, everything else is anonymous. And how do we measure this? We use the so-called social value slider measure, which you see here on the left side. So basically 6 money distribution tasks, where you have to say which of 9 options you prefer. And each of these options involves some money for you and some money for the other person from the other nation. In this case, for instance, you see the slider on the just to the laser pointer. If you look at the first slider, you might see that the first option would be you receive 85 thaler and the other 85 thaler. And if you move to the right, then you receive 85 thaler and the other only 15 thalers. And you make choices over all these options. And from this, the classic analysis would be to calculate what is called the social value orientation angle, which means you can see this in the system here. You can either have an angle of 0, where you give no weight to the outcome of the other, only weight to yourself, so you're individualistic, or you give some weight to the outcome of the other, then you're more pro-social, which would be a positive social value orientation angle, or you become a bit more negative, then you go lower here, you have a negative angle, which would mean that you are competitive, you give negative weight to the outcome of the other, so you're more happy if the other person has less money. So these are the people which you usually don't want to have in your team. You want to have in your team the people who are pro-social, will give weight on your positive value. Okay. This doesn't move. Sorry. There's some problems here. All right, now it's moving.
Andreas, can I ask you in the meantime some clarification about this diagram? So a point here, so you know exactly the relationship between yourself and the other, self-regarding person and the other regarding preferences, and you also can see the total welfare, but you cannot see the other options that people had to choose from, right?
You see basically you see only your option. So basically what you choose, and you see all of these 9 options. So basically you see all of this on the screen.
No,
So,
I understand the participants see, but when you put a point on what the participant selected, it doesn't tell you what were the other options, right? That he
yes,
considered.
that's right. So it's not communicated what the alternatives were. So the counterfactual is not communicated. Yeah. So sorry for the.
Maybe it's the transition to the laser pointer.
Yeah, this somehow messed it up. I think I will not use the laser pointer in the future. So,
but we can see your mouse, so we can use it.
Yeah.
So we can.
So yeah. Okay. One important thing which will become important later is that in some of these options you have more than the other, and in some of the other options you will receive less than the other. And there are even some full sliders in which, in all cases, you receive more than the other. For instance, slider 1 and slider 6. And in slider 3, it's the other way around. So basically, you always have less or equal than the other, which will become very important later. So what we aim to do in this research is we try to integrate theories from social psychology using computational modeling based on a paper by Jenkins. We try to integrate social value orientation, social perception models, group perception models, and group processing models. Yeah, a little bit in line with recent approaches of theory integration suggested by Gigerans and other people. What is this model by Jenkins about? It's basically a very simple model of utility model of giving, which differentiates between 2 situations. The upper situation here, you see, if you have more than the other, so if you receive more than the other in such a task, then you have a parameter alpha, which gives some weight to your outcome and the rest to the other. And you have some situation B in which you receive less than the other. So you are behind, basically. And then you have a parameter beta, which gives some weight to the outcome of the other. So very simple model, and with 2 parameters. And what they found is that alpha and beta depend on communion, basically on the warmth of the perceived warmth of the other group. And they made the beta parameter depend on the agency, so the competence of the other group. And they found that, so this alpha increases with perceived communion or warmth of the group. So you basically, if you're ahead, you give more to the nurse than to the lawyer. People usually think that the group of nurses are warm. And so if they are ahead, they give more to them as compared to the lawyers. But if they are behind, then they become more competitive to the lawyer as compared to the welfare recipient. So then the beta is lower and becomes sometimes negative. And what was very interesting about this model, it was not only able to basically predict data in some artificial experiment, but also to out of sample predict behavior and discrimination tasks all over the world, like discrimination in the labor market in Canada by name and something. So just taking some random sample of MTurk participants, asking them about their stereotypes of some groups, of some people somewhere, and using this to predict behavior of discrimination in some other people, so which is really cool and very impressive. So we use this as the basic model, and we take some other models which have been established in literature. The first is basically a standard model, which is similar to just calculating the social value orientation angle, which has just one weight for the outcome of the other and the rest for the outcome of the own and of the other outcome, which is basically just a simplification of the SPW model. We have a 2-parameter model which takes into account altruism and equality. So basically we have a weight for the own and for the other outcome, and some weight for the difference, usually negative weight. So people don't like it if things are unequal. So basically this is an inequality or inequality model. Ackerman found in a comparison in the earlier work that this was the best model among lots of different social value orientation models. And we have another model, which is the efficiency model, which goes to the commentary just asked by you, Kenneth, I think. So which takes into account also the efficiency, basically that gives some weight that the sum of the outcomes is particularly high. To be honest, the tasks which we used here are not very good for estimating model 3, as we figured out. So model 3 is, in lots of, I will not talk much about model 3 because, the fitting is not really good. for this model. Only in one fitting we found, and there was also not very good fitting the data. But yeah, this might also be due to the kind of tasks we used here. So just a few more modeling details without talking too much about it. So the people basically answered these 6 sliders, which I just showed you, for 25 nations. So basically for all nations with whom they interacted in the study, and including their own nation. Plus they gave these ratings in the first round before they saw all these other nations, just to a very generic person. So basically just without telling anything about nations. We want to measure something like generic social preferences with this in the first place. Then we use the softmax rule, which basically just transforms the utility from the previous equations into some probability, and then use some maximum estimation, likelihood estimation with standard errors clustered at the participant level to estimate these parameters. So I can talk more about these details, but it's not so important. I think more important is this part here. Why is this important, this research? In the previous study, we found that we had 10 countries interacting with 10 other countries, and we measured already social preferences, which is on the x-axis, so that's the angle, social value orientation angle. The higher, the more pro-social. And on the y-axis, we had the same people in a different task. They did basically cooperate in a prisoner's dilemma game. So higher is more cooperative and lower is less cooperative. And each of these dots is an interaction, or the mean of the interactions between people from one country and a different country. So for instance, here, this green dot is how all Mexicans on average work together with other Mexicans. And you see they have the highest social value orientation angle and the highest cooperation also. Here, for instance, perhaps interesting for Peter, the Mexicans have the highest pro-social value orientation concerning the Dutch. For whatever reason, we don't know. And we also, on the other side of the spectrum, we have lots of plausible findings. So the Chinese have very low social preferences for Japan and low cooperation, and the other way around as well. And China has low social preferences for the US and the other, and also low cooperation. So you basically can predict cooperation between countries from these cross-national social preferences at a correlation point of 0.81, which is, I think, a huge effect. And this is exactly the aim of the whole project. We want to basically be able to predict which countries can cooperate with each other particularly well. And we want to use it in some climate games to make some suggestions how cooperation in climate games might become on the long run better by basically composing better groups. I will come back to this later. So this is how the study looked. There are several studies. The first study was hypothetical in the US only. I won't talk about this today. The results are basically very similar. I will talk about the second study, cross-national study. We had 25 sender nations, so people from 25 nations participated in the study. They interacted with 25 receiver nations. So basically, they indicated their behavior towards all nations, including their own. So the receiver nation was a within subject factor. So they basically indicated for all the countries how they would behave to the country. One of these interactions was randomly drawn, and they knew this in advance, and this was then also paid. And we told them that the incentives were purchase power corrected using the Big Mac index with more than 6,000 people. So we had a huge sample and quite long study, 50 minutes of each of these per person took part in the study. We measured as dependent variables the generic social preferences. So basically the social preference on the slider for just some person without telling the nation. Then for the cross-national social preferences, that's what I just told you, that the preferences toward people from Japan, for instance. Then we measured as predictors nation-specific stereotypes. So they basically indicated how agentic, how conservative, and how warm they thought the people from the other countries are, including their own country. They rated the conflict between their own country and the other country. They rated the trust in the institutions in their own country. And then we took some variables, country-level variables from available sources like Hofstede dimensions. So this is cultural similarity was calculated there. Cultural fixation index, then the similarity on the stereotype dimensions on the group level was calculated. And we also took the GDP differences, so basically wealth differences between the countries into account, also the rule of law, so basically how well the laws are implemented in different countries, I have to mention the GDP difference data are a little bit preliminary because we recently received an update of this data, though we have to double check this in detail. But these were, I will not talk too much about the country level variables today. These are the studies which were included in this study, or the countries which were included in the study were 25 nations. We tried to sample them to be culturally diverse, to have rich and poor countries. And we also tried to sample non-weird countries. So we have lots of countries from Africa. We have South American countries. We have Arabic countries. You see lots of countries which are not just Western countries. And yeah, the questionnaire was translated for all of these countries. And yeah, so this was quite a huge thing. Here the sample again, we had samples of about 150 to 260 people per nation. This was due to the fact that the panel provider didn't have enough people from Norway, for instance, to begin with, so we didn't plan for having 200 people there, so it was not possible to get so many. But in principle, we had roughly 200 people per nation. They were representative according to age and gender. They had a bit higher college degree than the standard population, and they had a middle political spectrum orientation. Again, the measure for cross-national social preferences, how the people saw it in their questionnaire. So you will now divide talents between yourself and another person from the following country. From China, please click the distribution of your choice. You are from Japan, the other person is from China, and then the people made these choices. From this, one could calculate the social value orientation angle for each nation, but we used it mainly for the modeling. And they indicated this for all 25 other nations, including their own nation. Then we asked them for these ABC stereotype ratings. Here you see an example, for instance, people rate how agentic people from Ghana are. So now please evaluate how powerless, low status, dominated, etc., versus powerful, high status, etc., are people from Ghana. And they did the same for the B rating, which was had labels like traditional, religious versus modern, alternative, liberal, and for communion, which has labels like untrustworthy, repellent versus trustworthy, likable, altruistic, warm. So these were taken from previous research in social psychology, so we didn't invent this. And they rated this for all other nations. Most importantly, we calculated similarities, or we calculated similarity on these stereotype dimensions between the countries. The GDP differences should be clear. So this is just the gross domestic product per capita. We took this from the World Bank. Switzerland is high, Norway is high, India, Ghana is low. And the rule of law was also from the World Bank, the measure of the quality of legal institutions. And here, for instance, Brazil, Turkey, Colombia were quite low, and Switzerland, New Zealand, Norway were quite high. And we focus on the rule of law in their own country. You can also analyze this for the receiver country, but we were interested in how the rule of law of the sender country influences social preferences. Trust in institution was measured like that. In the following, we would like to know whether you trust local national institutions, for instance, local institutional authorities, national institutional authorities, legal system, political system, etc. Conflict was measured like that. All people indicated whether they had conflict with Switzerland, Germany, and so on. Yeah, so this to our measures. Coming to the results. This is basically I don't expect you to see the results here, but just to get a rough impression that there's quite some variance here. You see on the y-axis the social value orientation angle, so the higher, the more pro-social, the lower, the less pro-social. On the x-axis, you see the receiver country, and the lines are the sender countries. And what you can roughly see here is that some nations have quite high lines. For instance, the brown line here, that's from New Zealand. They tend to be quite pro-social on average. This lower line here, this is the people from Turkey, seem to be quite less pro-social. So there seem to be sender effects or differences between countries. We see receiver effects. For instance, we have this dip low here, for instance, for China. So the receiver country main effects seem to be there, and also for the US. We see also specific interactions. So for instance, the people from some countries, for instance, here from Colombia, are very positive pro-social to people from Ghana, but not to other countries. And here the people from Turkey are very low pro-social to people from Saudi Arabia and Arabic Emirates, for instance. And these effects are huge. So these are average effects, but you see here on the upper end, you have basically the rate to the outcome of the own outcome is basically 2 times as high as the rate to the other outcome, or 1.75. And here the lower scale is the people give really a little weight to the outcome of the other. So the own outcome is 6 times higher than the outcome of other rated. So this is huge differences here to be explained. Yeah, we have also lots of variants on the present conflict. Don't have to go into detail. Norway has conflict with China and so on. You can this is all in line with what you would expect. And most of the countries don't have contact with the other countries, with exception that people have lots of contact with the neighboring countries. These are the peaks, upward peaks here, but don't want to go into detail with this. Yeah, and people think that people from the US, from China, from Germany are quite agentic, which makes sense. People think that people from China, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and the US are more on the liberal side, and the Arabic countries are more on the conservative religious side, which makes also sense. And communion, people think that New Zealand people, Swedish people, Japan people are more communal than people from Brazil, for instance, Chile, and so on. These factors are to some degree correlated, 0.40, 0.50, so keep in mind they're not independent. Trusted institutions, I don't want to go into detail here, quite surprising findings. The Arabic countries have higher trust in their own institutions and also in China than in the other countries, which I found surprising, but in hindsight, perhaps not so surprising. Usually we just use our Western perspective to estimate how much they would trust their institutions, but perhaps from the inside, it's a bit different, which is also interesting, but don't want to talk about this today. Yeah, which basic model predicts the data best, and are the difference between these generic social preferences, so basically without mentioning nations, compared to preferences where names come as nations come into play. And yeah, we come to some tables here of the generic social preferences. Sorry. Here are the different models. I don't want to go too much into detail here, but I want you to just focus on the BICs here. This basically indicates the overall model fit, and as we hoped for, Model 4 was the best model by far. It was the same, it has the same fit as Model 2, which is also not surprising because Model 2 is basically just a reformulation of Model 4. It basically just splits up the variance in a bit different way. So it doesn't, yeah, so this is necessarily the case. The fit is the same. We also find quite interesting, so that for the alpha, we have so if you're ahead, so basically if you have more than the other, then people give quite a lot of weight on the outcome of the other people, roughly 50% and even 60% weight on the outcome of the other, and only 30%, 40% of their own outcome. But if they are behind, then people are really competitive, so they give negative weight of the outcome of the other, and this which means very high weight on the outcome itself. And this already for generic social preferences. If you take into account cross-national social preferences, which are just interactions with 25 nations, then you find essentially the same effect that the Model 4 and Model 2 are the best models. And you already see that these coefficients for alpha and beta look a bit different here. So there seem to be some differences between generic social preferences and cross-national social preferences. We will investigate them a bit more detail later. So concerning our first research question, Model 4 seems to be promising. And concerning our second research questions, here I would ask you to focus on Model 4, which is just basically the SPW model. You see, we just put it in some indicators or some variables which predict alpha beyond the constant. It's a dummy variable. It just indicates whether it's generic social preferences or cross-national social preferences. And we see some significant effect here. And also for beta, so there seem to be, in principle, generic social preferences, the alpha seems to be higher, so they seem to be more pro-social to an unspecified stranger than in the cross-national interactions, but they also seem to be more competitive to this unspecified stranger. And you see pretty much the same effect for in-group versus out-group. So for the in-group, they are more pro-social towards the in-group. That is in standard with in line with the standard finding by Nashville and others. But you also see at the same time that they are more competitive to the in-group members if they are behind, which leads us to the core conclusion of this talk. I will come to this repeatedly again. We see at the same time in-group love and nasty neighbor effects here in this data. So they are more competitive, so this effect is negative, so they give much more negative weight, so they worry more about if they are behind for the in-group than for the out-group. So the summary of this first part is that this SPW model, even without stereotype predictors, seems to be the best model, and we will focus on this as we hoped for, and as we pre-registered our further studies. We analyzed this then in a bit more detail. We found that generic and cross-national social preference seem to be quite different, and we have this opposite effect of in-group on alpha and beta, which we want to explain later a bit more. Yeah, so, and for our overall model, which we want to develop over time, we see that it's two-factor models. The SPW model seems to be a good starting point, and the model should probably include some predictor for in-group versus out-group. Then we looked at different hypotheses, which were, of course, all pre-registered, and I don't want to go too much into detail here. The model 4 is, again, a comparative model without any predictors, but each of these columns tests one of the hypotheses. For instance, here, hypothesis 1 is just replicating the Jenkins findings. They predicted that if you perceive the other nation to be particularly communal or warm, then alpha should be higher. So basically, we should be more pro-social to other nations, which we think that they are communal or warm. And this is the case, so we replicate Jenkins here. We don't replicate the negative agency effect on beta. So they found that the more agentic we think the other nation is, the more competitive we are, so the lower the beta, but this was not the case in our data. We additionally find that the similarity in beliefs plays a role for alpha, so basically the conservative and religious countries among themselves are more pro-social, or they help each other more, and the liberal and the modern countries help each other more, are more concerned about their wealth and their pro-sociality. It's not the case for beta, so not so much if they are behind, but only if they are ahead. We have several further hypotheses here. Again, the hypothesis concerning in-group effect on alpha. I already showed it to you. For the in-group, we have the standard finding. So if you just have an indicator variable for in-group and make this estimate this as predictor for alpha, then we see this is positive. Basically saying, if you interact with the in-group as compared to all other out-group nations or 24 other out-group nations, and if you are ahead, then you give more weight to the outcomes of the in-group. So we are more pro-social to the in-group than to the out-group. Nothing surprising here. But here again, for the out-group, for the beta, it looks very different. So if you are behind, in the situation where you're behind, you're really much more competitive to the in-group than the out-group. You see the minus sign here. And you find similar findings if you just put in all kinds of similarity predictors. This is similarity concerning Hofstede cultural factors, concerning cultural fixation index, concerning ABC, concerning stereotype similarity on a group, on an individual level. They all go in the same direction. Basically, for alpha, if you are ahead, then you're more pro-social, the more similar you are. So to more similar countries, you're more pro-social, but only if you are ahead. If you look at the same predictors for being behind, so these are the same predictors for beta. You see now beta here and Hofstede and all these things. Then the coefficients become mainly negative, and two of them also significantly. So basically, if you are behind, then you become more competitive, not only to the in-group, but also generally to the more similar countries concerning culture, but also concerning the stereotype ABC dimensions, which I described to you earlier. So if you want to summarize this, so the Jenkins model is a good starting point, but for cross-national social interactions, we see that it has limited value. There seem to be some additions necessary. We see that culture and stereotype similarity play a role too. For alpha and for beta, we see that similarity in ABC is somehow a novel finding in the classic study that just investigated warmth and competence, which were the factors A and C, but not the belief factor. And we see, most importantly, the constellation makes a huge difference. So being, so with this positive and negative effects of in-group dependence, if you're ahead, then there's in-group favoritism, and if you're behind, then we have seen it as the neighbor effect. We have some further relevant factors which should be included in the overall models, the communion for alpha and the similarity for alpha and beta. Further hypotheses investigated economic factors. Don't have to go too much into detail here. Not so much surprising things here. You see that if people are ahead, so for the alpha, in these situations where they receive more than the other, then the richer countries give more to the poorer countries. This is what GDP difference means. So the numbers are high if your country is richer than the other country. We see no effect on the beta. For trust in institutions, effects are a bit unstable. Don't want to overinterpret them. They get significant, but it's not so much there. For the rule of law, we have quite strong effects, a bit surprising, but the rule of law in the sender countries, or in the countries where the World Bank thinks that the laws are implemented quite well there. The people, they are more pro-social if they are ahead, and they're also, but they're also more competitive if they are behind. So exactly, essentially the same pattern as we have for in-group and out-group effects. And here the conflict predictors. So you see conflict in the past as a negative effect on alpha, as you would expect, and also in the present conflict even stronger. So basically what you see here is that people are less pro-social to other nations which their own country has a conflict. They perceive their own country to have a conflict, which is not overly surprising, particularly if they have more than the other. But if they are behind, then the effects become a bit different and a bit unstable. Actually, the effect is even significant in the opposite direction here. For the beta, we don't exactly know why this is the case, to be honest. So we had expected negative effects here. Yeah, so the economic institutional factors play a role too, but to some degree they are not all so very stable. But if you want to make a complete model, then GDP diff effect should be included for alpha. Rule of law could be included as factors for alpha and beta, and the present conflict as a predictor for alpha. Yeah, and that's basically how the overall model then looks like. And I have two versions. It's very much included there, but of course, remember, I tried to include or to integrate 5 kinds of models, or 5 different models from social psychology here. And the result is basically, if you just take all these theoretically derived predictors, most of them play a role. We additionally found that social economic status and age and gender played a role. We included them in the model as well. And then we come to a model which is even much better concerning BIC than all the previous models. So the fit of the data is basically better by a base factor of 10 to the power of 100. So it's really hugely better if you just include all these factors. And yeah, mainly the effects are in the same direction as I have reported you already in the univariate analysis. So if you analyze them all alone or together, it doesn't make a big of a difference. The new factor here is for social economic status, which is quite interesting. To the people who indicate themselves to be high in the social ladder in their own nation, they are not so pro-social if they are ahead. So basically, the people who think they are not so high in the social status in their own country, they help others more if they are ahead than the people who are richer or feel to be higher in the hierarchy. And we have the opposite effect for the social economic status if they are behind. So the people high in social economic status are also not so competitive if they are behind, which makes sense. So their personal value is not so much threatened by being behind than people perhaps low on the social ladder. Yeah, all these findings are robust if we include country dummies and if we use some different clustering, which is the second model here, but I don't want to go into detail with this. Overall, actually, one last slide actually followed up on some comments by some colleagues from Amsterdam where I presented it recently. All this modeling, if you don't trust the modeling and still want to understand the core point, you can also look at the individual items and you see the effect there as well. So basically what's currently done, you take 6 items, average over 6 items and calculate how pro-social a person is. If you just split up the items by the items in which the own person always has more than the other person, which is item 1 and item 6. And you have the other item 3, where the opposite is the case. Then you see huge effects. So that people for the in-group, they select the option where the in-group gets more than the out-group in the sliders where they have more than the other. But in the other item, where the other situation is the case where they always have less than the other, then we also find exactly the out-group hit at the nasty neighbor effect. So basically, for 2 of the items, which are the cleanest test of in-group favoritism in case of being ahead, you see significant, huge effects of the standard finding in-group favoritism. But if you just look at the slider 3, which just generates the opposite situation, then you see the nasty neighbor effect. And all of the studies which have been conducted so far just average over all these and just calculate one number and not differentiate between 2 weights, like 2 parameters. Therefore, they don't see the difference. And in some cases, they have a null finding there because they just cancel out each other. Or it's not so robust findings. We didn't anticipate this a priori, but in hindsight, this makes very much sense and brings together lots of findings, also conflicting findings from previous research. Yeah, so the discussion we have, we see substantial differences between generic and cross-national social preferences, which was a bit the motivation to investigate the latter. So if they would have been the same or not so much different, then probably investigating cross-national social preferences would have no meaning, but we see that they are quite different. We see that this model 4, this SPW model, is basically a quite good starting point for cross-national social preferences, but we need some different predictors for alpha and beta. So only communion is still a good predictor for alpha, but the effect of agency on beta was not replicated. We find a host of different factors which are relevant too, which are also theoretically predicted. Similarity in beliefs plays a role. And from looking a little bit further away on the data, we see that there seem to be quite different psychological processes for receiving more or receiving less. So in the situation or for the options where people receive more than the other nation, then we have all this in-group favoritism and similarity is seen positive. And receiving less, then people seem to come in a competitive mode, and exactly the opposite findings are found almost for all predictor variables. So what we think here, and this is mere speculation, but to explain the results, if you're ahead, then compassion is the thing which drives it. So you basically are compassionate with the in-group, with a similar person. But if you're behind, then social comparison processes in line with social comparison theory of Festinger plays a role. Basically, it's even worse if you are behind in the in-group and with similar people. And we have this social economic status finding, which was not predicted, but in hindsight also makes sense. So the high social economic people, they care not so much about others when being ahead, but they're also not so competitive if they're behind. So they're less threatened by social comparison, but they also don't care so much about the others if they have more than the others, which perhaps aligns with several observations which we have in the real world. Where let's say the highest status people not always cooperating the most. Yeah, what we tried to do and which was quite successful in the end, also the model in the end is quite complicated, but we were able to integrate social preference models with this stereotype models, with social identity theory, with social categorization theory, which made predictions in opposite directions, with realistic resource conflict theory, and even with theories about institutional factors. And yeah, this study also has some limitations. And we need to do some further robustness checks. GDP difference, I already mentioned, it's a little bit preliminary. Also for rule of law and the other factors. I'm still trying to check the robustness of these findings. And there's lots of further research which we can think about, of course, analyzing this on a process level, which would be very interesting. Using process tracing, response time, what do people really do if they make such decisions? Is it really the case that the psychological processes are very different, the emotions are very different? What would be the influence of time pressure? Also the difference between experienced And having no experience might be interesting. So experience-based updating. So if you have interact now with a person from this country, what happens? How do you update your belief system, which would probably bridge these findings to the classic description experience gap findings, where I think, okay, now you collect experiences with people from these nations, and what do you do with it? Sampling bias might play a role there too. But the long-term goal of this current project is to optimize cross-cultural cooperation by designing optimal group composition. So our idea would be, and this is our hypothesis, we haven't done it experimentally, but this will be the next study, to put together people from nations where we find that they have particularly high cross-national social preferences, let them play some climate games and see whether we can increase the general level of cooperation in a global climate game by designing more optimal groups. So for instance, if you think about climate negotiations currently, might be interesting to make subgroups of negotiating first some preliminary contributions, and then later on coming back in a bigger group, and then perhaps coming to higher positive outcomes from these negotiations. Yeah, this is the long-term goal. So we have several goals with this project, but for now, thank you very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
So thank you. I think we have already one question by Ori. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yes, Ori, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, go.
Okay.
Sorry, Ori.
Okay. So thanks, Andy. I don't think you mentioned it, but maybe I got it. I failed to understand something. But is it true that you can basically sum the results of the in-group favoritism and neighbor, what you call it, nasty neighbor, by saying that for within the country, people are more inequality averse? Is it just the same direction?
No, actually not. The inequality aversion. So in principle, you see that actually this would be more the analysis if you would include model 2, but model 4, the SPW model, basically doesn't speak so clearly to inequality aversion there. So it's more like you give, if you for the in-group and for more similar other nations, if you are ahead, or if you receive more than the other, then you are in the sense inequality averse, that you give more to the other nation, which is true. But it's also not only for the in-group, but it's also for out-groups, it's for similar out-groups, and so on. So
yeah, but more inequality averse. I'm saying more inequality averse.
But yeah, only for the. But you have to split up the situation for being ahead and being behind. For being behind, basically for the in-group, you are because you are behind, you want to really catch up. So basically, this is also in line with the standard finding by the Fair-Schmidt model, where you basically think that it even hurts you more if you're behind than if you're ahead. Yeah, so this is not, so to some degree, this is in line with these findings, but we try to differentiate them even a bit further. And as we see, it's not only with the in-group, but it's also with out-groups, and goes to some degree.
It is an interesting finding. I think it's I don't think it's been made, but I think that this is what it means. It means that for your in-group, you're more similar and you're more inequality averse. This is basically both of these effects together. Right? I think.
I have to think a little bit more about it. I think the other model, I have to look at the model 2, because model 2 directly has inequality aversion as one of the parameters included. Here it's a bit hidden, or it's a bit distributed in two parameters. Therefore, it's not so easy to say. But
Okay.
I will check it in the model 2, where we have one parameter, particularly for inequality aversion, and then I can test your hypothesis even with more confidence. But intuitively, I would agree with what you say, but I have to think a bit about it a bit more to be 100% sure. But it's a very interesting idea to think about it from different angles. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, Ido.
Okay. Yeah, I just posted in the chat an article which is related to what Uri just said. It's a little bit long shot. There is a paper by two people in my department that try to explain the home bias. The home bias in investing, that is, people invest in firms from their own region, which is a violation of economic theory. And the explanation they propose is really, they assume that they assume your results. They don't have evidence for that. But basically, the name of the paper I just posted is Keeping Up with the Joneses. So the idea is that I invest in companies in my areas because I know my neighbor works in that company. If this company will do well, he become rich. I want to become rich too. I want to be more similar to my neighbor, and if they're going to fall down, that's not such a big deal. I'm okay to fall down with my neighbor as long as they also have a chauvinist explanation there. I will not get to the chauvinist explanation. This paper was it was published in 2004, but they start talking about it. It takes them about 15 years to publish it. But I think that the connection to your results. So basically, their paper is a nice speculation, but I think your results are supported that their story, and maybe it will be a good idea to connect it, because a home bias is really important puzzle, and if you can shed light on it, this is important.
Yeah, thank you very much for the suggestion. It's indeed interesting what whether one can combine it to the home bias. Yeah, I will look at the paper. I'm not such an expert on this, but in principle, if you are ahead, then this would be the case. So if you get more, then you want to give up to the in-group. This would be the home bias. But if you're behind, then you want to catch up.
You just want to be close to the Joneses. You don't want to be behind. If they're doing well, you want to do well. If they're doing bad, you're okay with being bad. You just don't want to. So basically, and this is what Uri said. Your results. I'm not sure if it's exactly the Schmidt model, but the direction is to try to close the gap between your neighbors when you are rich, but you don't want the neighbor to be richer than you. This is basically their assumption, and this is what your results show. And they argue this explains the home bias, which is a little bit long shot, but they have a hard time publishing this paper. But I see somehow, well, I'm not sure if they have citation at all. I really like that paper.
Okay, thank you for pointing me that.
It was cited by 57 papers. So after a hard time publishing it, eventually it's got citations.
Okay, that's nice to see. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat, unless there is someone else who wants to ask in person. So Peter Ayton is asking, is it a good idea to take advantage of the revealed measures of cross-country cooperation to use in climate change games? Surely we should aim to increase inter-country cooperation where it's currently low, rather than risk building up current alliances and animosities in a reactionary way.
So the last, so Peter, thank you very much for the question or for the comment. I'm not sure whether I get the last part of it. I have to. So of course our idea was to use the social preferences in the climate game, yes, and so our hope was that if cooperation in the climate game goes up, this would be good for the whole world, yes.
Well, maybe I can just elaborate a little bit, because climate change is a global problem, right? It's not a local thing involving the cooperation of countries that get along well together. That's arguably one of the causes of the problem and one of the causes of the impediments to the problem, that there are sort of groups of countries that have a different perspective than other groups of countries. And if you put them together to sort of foster the sort of action around the alliances that are currently there, maybe you're just going to make things worse, not better.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to how to structure this interaction. I think this I would reframe it. It could be the case that they're basically then forming an in-group and then competing with the others, or basically you make just some bigger and perhaps even harsher boundaries. And we see this in current politics to some degree, that they are forming new coalitions at some points, which might make things not much better than they have been before. But our idea would be that you have a two-stage process. So you have a climate negotiation game where you basically come up with a solution first in a local climate game and then use the solution in a global game. So basically you have two stages where you agree on some level of cooperation, and then you go to the second game and then you discuss what could be the solution, and perhaps this might help. Basically the second step would be like in the classic Sharif experiment, trying to get rid of the group conflict. And so the first part might induce what you say, Peter, that people might become a bit in-groupy, but hopefully the second step, when you bring them together then to have a common goal, like classic Rubber's Cave, then perhaps we can leverage this and then come to a higher contribution level. But yeah, so this was the general idea, but I'm happy for any critical comments here.
I should say straight away, I don't know enough about it at all, but I sort of understand maybe naively that part of the problem in getting action on this issue is that there's the developed world and the developing world, and they're not aligned in the way that their economic activity and so on. You know, the developed world wants to farm out their dirty processes to the developing world, and the developing world wants to you know, catch up, and they're not, you know, on the same page in terms of how they view the consequences of all of these actions. And your plan just looked a little risky to me in terms of like fostering these this division rather than unraveling it. But I mean, I think your findings could be used obviously in all sorts of interesting ways, but whether that's the exact right way, I'm not sure.
And I think this it's very important to think about it from all these critical perspectives as well. And as you say, perhaps we find a composition of groups where we particularly split up these things. So perhaps we find some, let's say, more developed and less developed countries, and which still have higher certain preferences to each other, and then put them together. And perhaps this could be a solution to it. But you're totally right. And this is, of course, a huge part of the conflict, that perhaps rightly so, the less developed countries say, we want to catch up. You have messed up all this carbon, and you have basically killed all your forests 200 years ago, and now we are rich and we are not yet. And so we now also have the right to do this, which has some truth to it. So I see the point, but perhaps it could be a way forward to take this into account and perhaps to anticipate it a little bit by making a group composition which avoids particularly these group borders. But it's a very important point. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, so thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I think the time is unfortunately running up, so those who have to go can go now, and we hope to see you in the next seminar. And those who want to stay are more than welcome to stay for additional few minutes for our informal discussion part. So thank you again.
Thank you for being here. Great to see you all.
I have a methodological question, not related exactly to your, my question is as follows. Why do you use the Toluna, right?
Yeah.
As a sampling